She didn't scream, she didn't beg, she simply placed a broken pregnancy test on the edge of his desk and walked out into the rain forever. He didn't even look up. 6 years later, he would find that same broken piece of plastic in a forgotten drawer and finally understand everything he had thrown away. This channel exists for those who believe that love is stronger than power, that family is worth more than any empire, and that even the coldest hearts can learn to feel again. One truth to carry with you today: never let your pride speak louder than your heart. Leave a comment, share this story, hit subscribe, and come back tomorrow because the next story is already waiting for you.
Camille stood up from the chair, her legs unsteady. She forced herself to be strong, knowing that if she faltered now, she might never recover. Ronan had already returned his focus to his laptop as if the matter was closed, as if her 3 years of dedication had been reduced to a simple signature. Now he was ready for his next appointment. But Camille did not leave right away. She paused in the center of the room. Her right hand reached into her apron pocket, her fingers closing around the small plastic object she had kept hidden all morning. She took it out. The pregnancy test, with its 2 distinct red lines, was still visible in the dim light. She glanced at it one last time. The 2 lines looked like separate roads that would never cross. One represented her current life, and the other, the life she could have had. Then, she broke it in half. The sound of the plastic snapping was loud in the quiet room. She broke it again into 3 pieces. She then let them fall onto the edge of his huge oak desk, where they scattered near a drawer. The sound of the plastic hitting the wood was faint, but for Camille, it carried more weight than any sound she had ever heard. Ronan glanced up. His gray eyes focused on her with a cold curiosity, the kind of interest a man has when he is used to controlling every aspect of his world. "What is that?" His voice was flat, without any emotion. It was the same tone he used when questioning his accountant about a strange transaction. Camille did not reply. For the first time in 3 years, she did not look down when he spoke. She turned to face him directly. Her brown eyes, filled with unshed tears, held an expression Ronan had never encountered before. It was not fear or hate, but a surprising pity for the man who was dismissing her. "Thank you for the 3 years, Mr. Marchetti," she said. Her voice was shaky, but each word was spoken with careful intention. "I just hope you are never kept awake at night by a decision you made without knowing the whole truth." Her words seemed to hang in the thick, cigar-scented air. Ronan said nothing, not because he was ignoring her, but because something in her tone left him speechless. For a man who always had the right words in any situation, this feeling was both new and annoying. Camille turned around and walked toward the door. Her gloved hand grasped the cool brass handle, and she pulled the door open. 2 bodyguards in the hall briefly looked at her before turning away. In their world, a departing housekeeper was not worth a second thought. The door shut quietly behind her, not with a slam, but with a gentle click as the latch settled into the frame. Yet that small sound would echo in Ronan Marchetti's mind for years, a persistent noise he could never quite place. Ronan sat perfectly still for several moments after the door closed. He looked at the signed agreement, the blue ink still fresh, and then his eyes moved to the wastebasket by the door. He felt a strange urge to get up and look inside, but he resisted. Ronan Marchetti was not the type of man to dig through trash to understand a maid's feelings. At least, that is what he told himself. Instead, he rose and walked to the window. From the second story of his mansion, through the thick, bulletproof glass, he gazed down at the front lawn. The heavy Chicago rain was coming down in sheets, making the perfect green lawn look like a gray, distorted mirror. In the middle of that grayness, Camille was walking toward the gate. She was not running or hiding her head from the downpour. She walked steadily along the stone path, like a person who was used to carrying burdens much heavier than rain. Her small form became blurry in the deluge as she passed the iron fence and the automatic gate that opened to release her from the Marchetti estate. She was re-entering a world she would have to face alone, with a new life quietly growing inside her. Ronan remained at the window until she had completely vanished. He was not sure why he watched for so long. He had fired employees before, ended partnerships, and made far colder choices without a second thought. But this felt different. It was something about her final words, the pity in her eyes instead of hatred, and the unexplained sound of plastic breaking. He returned to his desk, sat down, and pulled his laptop closer, forcing his mind back to numbers and business calls. This was how Ronan Marchetti dealt with any emotion he did not want to acknowledge. He worked until the feeling went away, but that night, as the large house fell silent, he lay alone in a bed far too big for one person. Camille's words echoed in his mind like a faint heartbeat. "I hope you are never kept awake at night." He opened his eyes and stared up at the dark ceiling. For the very first time, he considered the possibility that he had missed something important. But the thought was fleeting. Ronan Marchetti had never been a man who could admit he was wrong. It would take 6 years for him to finally grasp that on that rainy night, he had pushed away more than just a woman in a wet uniform. He had sent away everything he never knew he needed. That evening, the Marchetti mansion was brightly lit, just like any other night. The private chef prepared dinner for a long table that could seat 12 people. However, only one plate was set at its head, in the spot Ronan always occupied. He faced a blank wall on the opposite side, as if emptiness was his preferred dinner guest. He cut his steak, raised his wineglass, and chewed with slow, deliberate movements, personally managed every facet of the vast Marchetti empire. The vibration of his phone cut through the silence of his dinner. He answered without a glance at the screen. At this level, only a few people had his number, and every call signaled either a profit or a problem. It was his uncle, Tommaso, informing him that a shipment needed to clear Southport by dawn. A problem with the crew required his immediate input. Ronan put down his wine, issued concise and unwavering orders in less than 2 minutes, and hung up. There was no indecision, no second-guessing, and certainly no lost sleep over a decision involving hundreds of thousands of dollars and risks most people could never comprehend. He went back to his steak, and his world continued to revolve around him with cold, smooth, mechanical precision. But after his meal, on the way to his office, he stopped just outside the door to the room Camille had left only hours before. He did not enter immediately, but stood for a moment, his gaze fixed on the spot on the carpet where she had been. Her last words echoed in the quiet of his mind. He took a slow breath, opened the door, sat at his desk, and buried himself in work. Ronan Marchetti saw any unproductive emotion as a vulnerability. In his life, being vulnerable was not just a failing, it was fatal. At that same moment, nearly 15 miles away from the Gold Coast estate, Camille was at a bus stop on Ashland, drenched by the relentless rain. A biting wind from Lake Michigan whipped through the shelter's broken glass panel. She was still in her black uniform, the white apron now a dirty gray from the downpour. A pair of yellow rubber gloves poked out from the pocket of the thin coat she had grabbed on her way out. The final city bus of the evening was 10 minutes behind schedule. For those 10 minutes, Camille stood under a flickering lamppost, one hand resting on her belly. It was not a gesture of pain, but of pure instinct, a move to protect the only thing in the world that was truly hers. The bus arrived with few passengers. She found a seat in the back by the window, resting her forehead on the cold glass as Chicago's lights blurred past. The towering, bright skyscrapers of downtown eventually faded, replaced by shorter, older, and darker buildings as the route pushed south. She saw the neon glow of corner stores, the steel gates pulled down over storefronts, and graffiti art on wet brick walls. This was Pilsen, the neighborhood she had always known, where Spanish filled the air and the scent of sweet bread from local bakeries was more comforting than any expensive fragrance from the Marchetti mansion. She stepped off at 18th Street and walked 2 blocks to an old red brick apartment building from the 1950s. The concrete steps were slick with mildew, the iron handrail felt loose, and the hall light seemed ready to burn out. She used the spare key her Aunt Polar always hid under a potted plant. Inside, the little apartment was still. Her aunt was asleep. Her labored breaths drifted from the back bedroom, the sound of a 52-year-old woman weakened by diabetes. Camille moved through the darkness to the small room she used. It held a single bed, a worn-out dresser, and a window that overlooked an alley where strays sometimes cried. She sat on the mattress, still cold and damp, and took out the agreement she had signed that afternoon. She looked down at her own signature, the blue ink a little blurry from a tear. For the first time since leaving that mansion, she allowed the fear to wash over her completely. It was not a fear of poverty or of being alone, but a fear for the new life inside of her. She understood Ronan Marchetti and the world he inhabited. She had spent 3 years cleaning up its messes. In that world, an illegitimate child of a crime boss was never a blessing. It was a pawn. Enemies would see the child as a target. Allies would see the child as a tool for negotiation. And Ronan? What would he do? Take the baby? Send it away? Make it just another dark secret hidden among the hundreds the Marchetti family kept? Camille carefully folded the paper, put it in the nightstand, and laid a hand on her stomach. It was still flat, showing no outward sign, but a tiny heart was beating inside. Each beat strengthened her resolve. She would not tell Ronan. This was not about hatred or revenge, but about protection. She would cut all ties to the Marchetti name. She would raise this child by herself. She would do it in her own world of late-night buses, modest apartments, and honest small paychecks. A world where people were not killed for what they knew, and children did not live behind bulletproof windows. She lay down and pulled the thin blanket over her, and there in the dark, just 15 miles from the Gold Coast, yet a world away, Camille Reyes felt a new kind of certainty. She would be stronger than her fear. She had to be, because she was living for two now. In the weeks that came after, Camille faced one closed door after another. She tried a restaurant on 18th Street, but the manager just glanced at her stomach and shook his head before she could even speak. The laundromat on Ashland told her they were fully staffed. A grocery store on Blue Island had a night position, but when she returned, her 4-month pregnancy was too obvious to hide. They said the job was already taken. Each time she was rejected, Camille held back her tears and just kept going. She had to, for the person inside who depended on her to be strong. She eventually got a job cleaning an office downtown, working from 10 at night until 4 in the morning. It paid cash weekly, just enough for her rent and groceries. But the daily bus fare was a cost she could not handle if she wanted to save money for after the baby's arrival. So she walked 40 minutes to downtown every afternoon and 40 minutes home just before sunrise, while her belly grew heavier and the soles of her shoes wore out. But her pace never faltered. Then the brutal Chicago winter descended. It was a cold that cut right to the bone, a wind off Lake Michigan that sliced through clothing as if it were not even there. One night in January, with the temperature at -15 degrees, Camille was on her way home when her legs just gave out. Her sight went blurry and her ears started to ring. Her 6-month belly threw her off balance, and she stumbled, catching herself on a streetlight before sliding down to the concrete. The snow soaked through her clothes. She tried to yell for help on the empty street at 3 in the morning, but her voice was a whisper, her breath a puff of white that vanished in the freezing air. She had no idea how long she was there, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15. When she heard footsteps and a warm hand touched her shoulder, she was sure it was a dream. It was Father Miguel Cortez, the priest from her church in Pilsen, on his way back, after seeing a parishioner who was gravely ill. He found her huddled at the base of a streetlight, pregnant, with purple lips, yet he asked no questions. He gently helped her up, placed his own thick wool coat around her, and walked her back to the church. He had her sit by the heater in the common area, brought her a bowl of warm soup, and waited for the color to return to her cheeks. "You do not need to explain anything," he said softly in Spanish. "You just need to know that you are not alone." From that evening forward, Father Miguel became the spiritual guide Camille never knew she needed. He could not give her much money, as the church itself was struggling, but he provided food from the community pantry each week, offered a warm place to rest when the Chicago cold was unbearable, and gave her the one thing no one else could: the belief that she was doing the right thing. Aunt Polar also tried to help in her own way. Her diabetes was weakening her daily. Her legs were too swollen for her to walk far. But on nights when Camille's sickness was so severe she could not lift her head, Polar would sit by her side, massaging her back with her trembling hands. She would share old stories of Camille's mother and how strong she was carrying Camille alone in Puerto Rico before moving to Chicago, implying that strength was a trait passed down through the women of their family. One afternoon, Camille walked past a thrift shop on 19th Street and noticed a roll of creamy white yarn for 50 cents. She paused outside the store for a moment before going inside to buy it. That evening, sitting on her bed in her tiny room, she started to knit a small hat. Her knitting skills were not great. The stitches were uneven, some loose and others too tight. Yet she continued, working slowly and patiently, speaking to her 7-month belly as she knit. "I can promise you will never lack for love. I will figure out the other things. But you will have more than enough love, because I have enough for both of us." The little hat was unattractive and poorly shaped, but Camille had made it with her very last pennies, and with the one thing no one could ever steal from her, her hope. The first contraction started at 2 o'clock in the morning one November night. As the Chicago wind howled outside her apartment window in Pilsen, Camille knew her time had come. She had to call an ambulance since no one could drive her. While she waited, she put the lumpy cream-colored hat she had spent 2 months knitting into her bag. It was the only thing she had managed to prepare for her arriving baby. Aunt Polar was woken by the ambulance siren. Her swollen feet carried her to the hallway, where she took Camille's hand and promised to follow on the first bus. But Camille knew the last bus had run hours ago, and the next would not arrive for several more. She just nodded, offering her aunt a reassuring smile, before getting into the ambulance by herself. Stroger Hospital at 3 o'clock in the morning was a world of cold neon lights, steady beeping, and long corridors. Camille was wheeled on a gurney as waves of pain washed over her. The delivery ward was packed because it was the biggest public hospital in Chicago, where women often came nightly to give birth, many of them just as alone as she was. A nurse named Rosa, a middle-aged Mexican woman with a gentle voice and warm hands, remained with Camille throughout her entire labor. When the pain became unbearable, Camille needed to grip someone's hand, not her mother's since she was gone, and not the hand of the man who should have been there, because he would never know. She took Rosa's hand, clenching it so tightly her own knuckles turned white, and Rosa squeezed right back, as if it were the most natural thing to do. For her it was. Because at Stroger Hospital, so many mothers brought new life into the world with only a nurse by their side. Amelia was born at 5:47 in the morning. Her first cry sliced through the silence, a declaration that she was here, that she was alive, and that she had arrived against all odds. The nurse placed Amelia on Camille's chest, and at that moment, everything else faded away. Camille looked down at the tiny infant against her skin. Her dark, wet hair was stuck to her scalp. Her skin was a blotchy pink and red, and her little fists were clenched tight, as if holding on to something unseen. And then Amelia opened her eyes. They were gray-green, not brown like Camille's, not dark like Aunt Polar's or anyone else in the Reyes family. They were a clear, deep gray-green. They were Ronan Marchetti's eyes looking up at her from the small face of her daughter. Camille began to weep. It was not from sorrow or from fear. She cried because she realized that no matter how far she ran or how thoroughly she removed the Marchetti name from her life, those eyes would be a daily reminder of the man she had decided not to tell. She hugged Amelia closer, kissing her baby's forehead, and spoke in a whisper meant only for them. "You belong to me. Only to me." A few hours later, When Aunt Polar finally arrived at the hospital, her eyes red and her breath ragged from walking part of the way, an administrator brought the birth certificate for Camille to complete. She filled out each line with a blue pen, her hands still unsteady from the ordeal. The child's name, Amelia Reyes, date of birth, place of birth, mother's name, Camille Reyes. Then she got to the line for the father, a blank space. The tip of her pen hovered over the form as she stared at that empty line for a long time. It was not because she was unsure what to write, but because she knew precisely whose name belonged there, and she was making the choice to leave it blank. She took a deep breath, skipped the line, and signed her name below as the mother. It was a signature that carried the weight of both roles she was now claiming. She then returned the form to the staff member and did not look back. 6 years on a calendar can seem to pass in an instant, but when each day is a struggle, 6 years can feel like a whole life. In the initial months after Amelia's birth, Camille would hold her baby with one arm while scrubbing office floors with the other, speaking figuratively, but the reality was not much different. She continued her downtown cleaning job at night, leaving Amelia with Aunt Polar in their small Pilsen apartment. In the daytime, while Amelia slept, Camille attended a free business management course for low-income women at the Pilsen Community Center. She sat with other immigrant women, many of whom were not yet fluent in English and often brought their young children to class. There, she learned about bookkeeping, tax calculation, and how to register a small business in Illinois. She was not the top student, but she was the only one who never missed a class. After 3 years of working for others, when Amelia began preschool, Camille had saved a small amount of money by living so frugally that she spent nearly nothing on anything but rent and food. She then registered Olympia Services, her very own cleaning company. Her first 2 contracts were with a dental office and a small accounting firm, both located in Pilsen. They were willing to hire her because they had seen her work ethic over the past 3 years. Camille made no grand promises. She only pledged to clean thoroughly and correctly, and she always delivered on that promise. Slowly, one satisfied client would recommend her to another. Within a year, she hired her first employee, a single mother from Guatemala named Maria, whom she had met at the community center. Then she hired another and another. By the time Amelia turned 5, Olympia Services employed 8 people. They were all single mothers or immigrants like her, women who had been rejected by other employers. But Camille gave them a chance. Her wages were not the highest, but she always paid on time. She provided insurance for each woman as soon as she could afford it, and she never treated anyone with disrespect, because she knew exactly how that felt. Amelia grew up in that apartment, which was small but always clean. Its walls decorated with butterflies. Camille's room had pictures she cut from magazines, and a twin bed was set against the wall. A misshapen cream-colored hat sat on the nightstand like a treasured memory. Aunt Polar's health was failing, but she still greeted Amelia each afternoon while Camille worked. She taught the little girl to make Spanish rice and shared stories of Puerto Rico. Amelia could speak both languages by 1st grade and had gray-green eyes that were a mystery in their neighborhood. Those eyes did not match anyone in the Reyes family. On the other side of Chicago, 6 years for Ronan Marchetti meant building an empire. His company, Marchetti Holdings, acquired 3 more large real estate projects by the Chicago River. This legitimate business front helped hide his illegal activities. He appeared in magazines as a successful entrepreneur. But in the criminal world, his name carried a much heavier meaning. He got married 2 years after Camille was gone, an arranged union with the daughter of an allied family. It was a political move, what people in their world called securing territory. The marriage lasted only 2 years. It ended with divorce papers and a massive settlement. His wife claimed she could not live with a man who was never truly at ease, even when he slept. A few other relationships followed, but none of them lasted more than a couple of months. Every woman told him the same thing before leaving him. You do not know how to trust anyone. Ronan never argued because he knew it was true. But he did not change either. In his world, trusting someone was not a strength, it was a liability. The Gold Coast mansion was still lit every night. It was still spotless, still perfect in every way, but it was also growing quieter. Dinner was always a single plate set at the head of the long table. The living room never echoed with laughter. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit alone in his office with a glass of whiskey, the blue light of his laptop on his face. The memory of that afternoon would return to him. Not the whole thing, just a single image. It was the look in Camille's eyes as she stood at the door to say goodbye. He had seen many eyes in his life, eyes filled with fear, hate, and begging, but hers were different. He did not recognize that look. Those were not the eyes of a guilty person. They were the eyes of disappointment. It was a profound disappointment, the kind reserved for someone you once believed was better. Strangely, that look haunted Ronan Marchetti more than any rival circling his business. He knew how to deal with enemies, but he had no idea what to do about the disappointment in the eyes of the woman he had sent away. The change started not with his conscience, but with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 6 years after Camille left, federal agents began to close in on a money laundering trail connected to Marchetti Holdings. 2 official summons arrived in a single week. Federal prosecutors started interviewing witnesses. An offshore account in the Cayman Islands was frozen without any notice. Ronan knew that to protect his empire, he needed to track every single dollar from the past 10 years. This was not so he could come clean to the authorities, but so he could figure out what to bury deeper and what he could afford to lose. He called Yelena Vulov, his personal lawyer and financial expert. He told her to conduct a complete internal audit, from the very top to the bottom. Yelena spent 3 weeks examining thousands of financial records, and her discovery surprised Ronan. She found a trail of strange cash withdrawals that went back for years. Each transaction was small enough to not set off any alarms, but they added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Every withdrawal was traced to one person who had access to the family's finances besides Ronan himself. That person was Gianni Marchetti. Yelena put the final report on Ronan's desk late one evening, looked him in the eye, and said, "The $50,000 from 6 years ago was not a one-time thing. It was just the beginning." Ronan read every single line. The numbers were undeniable. Gianni had been stealing money from a secondary safe, from business accounts, and from the secret fund used for illegal operations. He did it all to pay off gambling debts to a loan shark connected with the Volkov syndicate. They were an Eastern European crime family fighting the Marchetti family for control of Chicago's South Side. His brother had not just stolen from him, he had been funding the enemy. Ronan closed the report. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he gave Yelena a simple 2-word command: "Bring him." Gianni arrived at the Gold Coast mansion at 10 that night, completely unaware of what was happening. He was still smiling when he entered, the same way he always did when visiting his brother. But this time, 2 bodyguards did not lead him to the living room. They took him down to the basement. The Marchetti mansion's basement was not for storing wine. It had bare concrete walls, harsh white lights, a steel table, and 2 chairs. This was the place where the family handled business that was never written down. Ronan was already waiting for him. Yelena's report was open on the table. When Gianni saw the numbers, his smile vanished. "Brother, please let me explain." "Sit down." Ronan's voice was quiet, but Gianni immediately sat. He recognized that tone of voice. It was the one Ronan used right before something terrible and permanent happened. Ronan did not ask many questions. He just pushed the report across the steel table and waited. Gianni denied it for the first 5 minutes. Then he tried to explain for the next 10. When Ronan still said nothing, just watching him with gray eyes as cold as the floor, Gianni finally broke. He admitted to everything. The gambling debts had started when he was 25. He told of nights losing everything at secret card games and loan sharks threatening to break his fingers if he did not pay. Desperation had led him to his brother's safe. Ronan listened to it all, took a slow breath, and then asked the final question. 6 years ago, did she take that money? There was silence. Gianni looked down at the floor. No. You knew the entire time. She was just a housekeeper, Gianni said, not daring to look up. Who was going to believe her? I thought you would never know, and it would all just be forgotten. The concrete room was so silent you could hear a single drop of water from a pipe. Ronan looked at his brother, the man who shared his family name, the man he grew up with in this very house. And in him, he saw the one thing in the world he despised most: his father. The old man, Marchetti, had been just like that. He used the weak as shields for his own failures. He punished people who could not defend themselves to protect his own. Ronan had promised himself he would never be that man. But 6 years ago, he had become his father without even knowing it. He had kicked out an innocent woman without a second thought, without even listening to her, without ever letting her defend herself, simply because she was the most vulnerable one there. In his world, the vulnerable always took the blame. Ronan stood, glancing down at Gianni a final time. You have 24 hours to get out of Chicago. Every account, every card, all access tied to this family is being shut down now. You are no longer a Marchetti. Gianni started to speak, but he saw his brother's eyes and fell silent, understanding that walking out of this basement was the only mercy he would ever get. After Gianni was gone, Ronan remained in the cold, concrete room. For the first time in 6 years, the memory of Camille Reyes wasn't a blur. It was clear, sharp, and painful, along with the knowledge that he owed her a debt that money could never settle. Once Gianni left, Ronan skipped his bedroom and went straight to his second-floor office. He had to be alone with the newly revealed truth. He needed to sit in the same room where, 6 years ago, he had made an innocent woman accept a punishment she did not earn. He sank into his chair without turning on the laptop or pouring a drink, sitting in the darkness as streetlights cast long stripes of light across the floor. He began to clean. The room was not dirty, but he needed something to do with his hands to keep his thoughts from shattering. He pulled open a desk drawer, shuffling through old documents, expired contracts, and outdated business cards. As he pulled the drawer completely out to set it aside, a small item fell from a tight space between the drawer's base and the desk frame, where it had been stuck for years. Ronan retrieved it, a small piece of white plastic, about 1.5 inches long, its color faintly yellowed from age. He was about to discard it, but the light from the window revealed a pale pink line stretching across the plastic. His hand stopped. A memory from 6 years prior flashed in his mind, hazy but distinct enough. Camille by the door, taking something from her apron, looking at it, and then breaking it. The sharp snap of plastic had echoed in the quiet room. He had asked, "What's that?" But she never gave him an answer. At the time, he did not press her for one. Now, holding the plastic piece, he finally cared. He took out his phone and did an image search for pregnancy tests. The screen displayed countless results. They were white plastic sticks with little windows that showed 1 or 2 pink lines. He compared the piece in his hand to the images on his screen. It was the same pink line, the same plastic, the same size. His heart began to pound. It was not the rush he got from facing danger, but the feeling of the solid ground beneath him giving way, making everything he believed he knew feel unstable. She had been pregnant that day. The thought struck him with a force he was not ready for. He placed the plastic on the desk, picked up his phone, and dialed Yolena. It was almost 1 in the morning, but Yolena picked up on the second ring. A call from Ronan Marchetti at 1 o'clock in the morning was never something that could be postponed. "I need you to find someone," he said. "Camille Reyes. She was an employee here 6 years ago. Find out everything about her for the last 6 years. Her address, job, family, all of it. And do it discreetly." Yelena never asked questions, so she only asked when he needed it. 2 days, Ronan replied, and ended the call. Yelena delivered in a day and a half. The report was on his desk the following afternoon, impeccably organized, thorough, and precise, just like all of Yelena's work. Camille Reyes, 28 years old, living in Pilsen, Chicago. She was the owner of Olympia Services, an industrial cleaning business registered in Illinois, with 8 employees. She had one daughter, Amelia Reyes, 5 years old, attending Orozco Academy, a public school in Pilsen. The birth certificate left the father's name blank. Ronan read that detail twice. 5 years old. She was pregnant 6 years ago with a child who was now 5. The math was brutally simple. He flipped to the next page and froze. Yelena had included a picture from Olympia Services' social media taken at a company family event. Camille was smiling among her employees, and next to her stood a little girl in a floral dress. She had thick, dark hair, a delicate chin, and gray-green eyes that looked directly at the camera with complete confidence. Ronan stared at the photograph, and his world came to a halt. He knew those eyes. He saw them in his own reflection every morning. That face, that chin, the fearless way the child met the camera's gaze. It was the exact same way he looked at everyone, without ever flinching. He put the report down, stood up, and walked out onto the balcony. The city of Chicago glittered below him with millions of lights. Somewhere in that sprawling city, in a small Pilsen apartment, a 5-year-old girl with his eyes was sleeping, completely unaware of who her father was. Ronan grabbed the balcony railing with both hands, and for the first time, those hands that had authorized actions most people could not even fathom, hands that had never once shaken before an enemy, started to tremble. Ronan was still figuring out his next move when fate made the decision for him. 2 weeks after that night on the balcony, staring at Chicago with trembling hands, Benny Tran, the manager of the Marchetti Holdings, 18-story office building in River North, presented a new cleaning contract to the administration office. Olympia Services was the chosen vendor, having offered the best price among 4 companies, earned top reviews from past clients, and possessing a flawless legal history. Benny was unaware of the relationship between the company's owner and his own boss. For him, it was just a standard business decision to pick the most affordable and effective contractor. The contract was approved, and the name Camille Reyes was entered into the internal system of Marchetti Holdings before Ronan even knew about it. Camille learned about the contract before Ronan did. The first day she went to the River North building for a site survey before her team started, she entered through the main lobby's glass doors and saw the name on a brass plaque on the marble wall. Marchetti Holdings. She stopped in her tracks. For 6 years, she had carefully constructed a life separate from that name. Now, it was right there in front of her, etched in polished brass, bright and unavoidable. Her immediate thought was to terminate the contract, go back to Pilsen, call Benny Tran, and withdraw her bid. To find a different contract, any contract that was not connected to the Marchetti name. But then she pictured the 8 employees who depended on her for work. This was the most significant contract she had ever secured. It was large enough to bring on 5 more staff members, large enough to finally provide health insurance for her entire team. That was the one benefit she had promised them from day one, but had never been able to afford. She stood in the lobby, her eyes fixed on the name on the wall, and then she took a long, deep breath. She was not the 22-year-old girl who used to tremble in her yellow rubber gloves. She was a business owner now. She had a valid contract, and she would not let fear dictate her choices ever again. She decided to keep the contract. For the initial 2 weeks, things ran smoothly. Camille's team worked in the late evenings and at night when the offices were empty, making the likelihood of an encounter with Ronan nearly zero. Camille would visit once a week in the afternoon for quality checks, sign documents with Benny Tran, and then leave, long before anyone on the top floor where Ronan worked knew she was in the building. She believed she could maintain that separation indefinitely. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon during the 3rd week, the fire sprinkler system on the 9th floor went off by mistake, setting off the alarms throughout the building. Red lights began to flash. The speakers broadcasted evacuation orders. Over 300 people began pouring into the stairwells, as the elevators had locked down automatically due to safety measures. Camille had been on the 12th floor, inspecting a newly cleaned section. Ronan was in a meeting with Yelena on the 15th floor. They both descended the emergency stairs along with everyone else. Between the 10th and 9th floors, the crowd came to a halt for a moment because an exit door was jammed. Camille turned to look up, just as Ronan was looking down. 6 years vanished in a single instant. She knew it was him right away. He was still tall, with the same cold gray eyes, and wearing a black suit just like the last time she had seen him. But now, there were light wrinkles around his eyes, and a touch of silver in his hair that was not there 6 years ago. He knew it was her as well, but she was not the young woman he recalled. Camille stood before him in a white blouse with a stand-up collar and slacks, her hair tied back in a tidy bun. An identification badge on her chest read, Limpia Services. Below the company name was a single word, owner. Her posture was straight. Her eyes met his directly. She was no longer the housekeeper in a black and white uniform, and they both understood that. Camille, he said. She had never heard him use that tone before. It was not commanding or cold, but almost shocked. Mr. Marchetti, she answered, her voice polite, calm, and perfectly distant. She then turned and continued down the stairs with everyone else. When the entire building had gathered in the lobby, they waited for the all-clear from the technicians. Ronan stood by the glass doors, looking out. But he was not watching the street. He was looking at the left corner of the lobby. A little girl with black hair sat in a chair next to one of Camille's workers. Her small legs dangled in the air as she drew in a notebook with a pencil. School was out for the day, and Camille had no one else to watch her daughter, so Amelia had to come with her. The little girl looked up as if she felt someone staring, and her gray-green eyes met Ronan's gray eyes from across the busy room. Amelia was not scared or shy. She just looked at him with the simple curiosity of a 5-year-old before looking back down to her drawing. But Ronan could not look away and go back to what he was doing. He just stood there in the lobby of the building he owned, with hundreds of his employees around him, and it felt like all the air had been stolen from his lungs. Because that little girl did not just have his eyes. She was a perfect, tiny version of him. And in that moment, he knew the photo he saw online was not a fake. The math had been correct. The plastic card in his drawer had been real. And the truth was sitting just 10 steps away from him, drawing in a small notebook with a pencil. She had no idea that the man staring at her with clenched fists was her biological father. 2 days after they saw each other in the emergency stairwell, Camille got a call from Ronan's assistant. She was invited to a meeting to discuss the cleaning services contract for the building. It would be held in his private office on the top floor. The reason sounded legitimate, just standard business. But Camille knew right away this was not about the contract. She said yes, because she was done with running away. That afternoon, she arrived at the building wearing a navy blazer, her hair in a low bun, with no jewelry or anything extra. The elevator took her up to the top floor. When the doors slid open, she saw a wide hall with gray stone floors and glass walls from floor to ceiling, offering a full view of the Chicago skyline. The Chicago River snaked below, a silver ribbon between the tall skyscrapers. An assistant showed her into a private conference room and then shut the door. Ronan was already inside. He was not wearing a suit today, just a black shirt with its sleeves rolled up. It was a small detail that Camille noticed right away, because Ronan Marchetti's suits were like his armor. The fact that he was not wearing one suggested he was trying to seem less intimidating. That intention alone told her this meeting was about much more than a cleaning contract. For the first 15 minutes, they discussed business. Ronan inquired about service quality, the frequency of supervision, and her quality control methods. Camille gave precise and professional answers, saying no more or less than necessary. She had been running Olympia services long enough to know how to face power without trembling, and Ronan could see that she was not the woman he recalled. He placed his pen on the desk and was silent for a moment. When he next spoke, his tone was completely different. no longer that of a chief executive officer assessing a contractor. 6 years ago, when you left my house, you were pregnant. He said it as a fact, not a question. Camille did not even blink. She showed no shock, none of the drama he might have anticipated. She met his stare and paused, letting him see that she was choosing her response carefully, not searching for one. That truth did not concern you 6 years ago, Mr. Marchetti. Why should it concern you now? Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow, not because they were untrue, but because they were entirely correct. He had no defense. 6 years ago, he had refused to listen, had not wanted to know, and had not given her a single opportunity to tell him. He inhaled slowly, and then did something he had almost never done in his 37 years. Not to anyone, I was wrong. Those 2 words were simple, yet they carried more weight than any command he had ever issued. Camille's expression did not change, but inside something shifted, because it was the first time she had ever heard the man concede he was wrong, and Camille understood that for someone like him, admitting fault was a far harder battle than any life or death struggle in the criminal world. I know about Gianni, he continued. I know you did not take the money. I know all of it, and I realized it far too late. Camille remained silent. She waited, sensing he had more to say. Ronan leaned in, his voice becoming a low rumble. But there is a reality you have to face, Camille. If that little girl has Marchetti blood, it does not matter what you want or how long you keep her hidden. She is in a kind of danger you cannot imagine. My enemies are more numerous than you realize, and they make no exceptions for family. Camille felt a chill run through her entire body. For 6 years, she had fled the Marchetti name for this very reason, knowing just how lethal that life was. She had once scrubbed blood from hallway floors, and knew violence was not the exception in his world. It was the only rule. But she also saw what 6 years in hiding had not changed. You could not simply wish blood away. Amelia's gray-green eyes would always be a giveaway, and if anyone ever decided to look hard enough, the truth would come out regardless of the blank space on the birth certificate. Amelia is not a game piece, she said, her voice unwavering even as her hands tightened into fists under the table. She is not an asset, she is not a liability, and she is not a target. She is my little girl. Is she my daughter too? The question hung in the air between them, in that glass room overlooking Chicago, suspended in 6 years of silence. Camille held his gaze for a long moment. There was no anger left in her eyes, no vulnerability, just the truth she had shouldered by herself for 6 years. And it had finally become too much to carry alone. Yes, she confirmed. Amelia is your daughter. The room fell completely quiet. The Chicago skyline sparkled behind the window, as if the world outside was oblivious to the fact that inside this room, a single admission had just altered 3 lives forever. Ronan drove back to his Gold Coast estate in total silence. He did not turn on the radio, take any calls, or issue any commands. For the first time in ages, he drove himself, not wanting a chauffeur to witness the look on his face. He pulled into the garage, moved through the dark corridors without flipping a switch, and walked directly to his office, shutting the door behind him. He sank into his familiar leather chair and poured a glass of whiskey from the Macallan bottle on the bar. He placed the glass on his desk and left it untouched. His right hand slid open a drawer. He pulled out the faded plastic piece of the pregnancy test and set it down next to his phone, which displayed the picture of Amelia that Yelena had found. The plastic shard and the digital image rested side by side on the polished oak. One was the evidence he had dismissed 6 years ago, and the other was the living result of that mistake. A 5-year-old girl who had his eyes and her mother's smile. He gazed at the picture and started counting. 5 birthdays had passed without him. On 5 Christmas mornings, he was not the one who placed her presents under the tree. He never saw her take her first step. He never heard her speak her first word. He was not there to see her off on her first day of school. When she ran a fever in the night, he was not there to watch over her. When she stumbled, he was not there to pick her up. 5 years, day after day, moment after moment, had all gone by while he remained completely unaware. And now that lost time stood before him like a verdict that no appeal could ever change. He glanced at the broken piece of plastic. He could still hear the snap it made in this very office 6 years before. At the time, he had asked, "What is that?" with a distracted tone before looking back at his laptop. If he had just gotten up, collected the pieces, examined them, and asked just one more question, everything might have turned out differently. But he had not, because he was Ronan Marchetti, a man who had mastered everything except how to listen when it truly counted. He sat there in the darkness, the glow from the streetlights outside casting a pale line across the untouched glass of whiskey. He felt something welling up inside his chest, a sensation that was hot, heavy, and strange. He did not recognize it at first, as it was a feeling he had buried since he was a boy, when his father taught him that tears were a sign of weakness, and weakness had no place in the Marchetti family. But on this night, no one was there to see. No rivals, no allies, no bodyguards. Oh, it was just him and the photograph of a 5-year-old daughter who had no idea who her father was. A single tear escaped from his right eye. He wiped it away instantly with the back of his hand, a quick, sharp motion, the reflex of a man conditioned to conceal any evidence of weakness. That tear, however, was real, and he felt its truth. 15 miles away in her Pilsen apartment, Camille perched on the edge of Amelia's bed, watching her daughter sleep. The little girl was curled on her side, clutching an old teddy bear. Her black hair fanned out on the pillow as she breathed softly and steadily. In the quiet room, Camille could hear the slow rotation of the ceiling fan and the faint cries of cats in the alley. She had built this peaceful life over 6 years with her own sweat and tears, including long nights walking 40 minutes home through the snow. Amelia had everything a child could need: friends, a good school, her Aunt Pearl, and a stable routine. The only thing missing was a father. But now, that father was aware she existed. A wave of fear washed over Camille. It was not a fear that Ronan would harm Amelia, but that his immense power would shatter the small, safe world she had so carefully constructed. His lawyers were far better than any she could afford, and his wealth was more than she could ever earn. If he pursued custody, she knew she would have no chance in court. Then she gazed at Amelia, recalling the question her daughter asked each year on Father's Day, when her class made cards for their dads. "Mom, who is my card for?" The words twisted her heart every single time. And each time she would answer, "Make one for your Aunt Pearl," before quickly turning away to hide her reddening eyes. Amelia deserved to know her father. Camille understood this truth, even as it fought against every protective instinct she had. Leaning down, she kissed Amelia's forehead, then walked into the living room to sit by herself in the darkness. In the same way, on the other side of the city, Ronan was also sitting alone in the dark. They were two people caught between the past and the future, torn by fear and duty, and by a truth that could no longer stay hidden. 3 days after that long night, Ronan called Camille. He was direct and to the point, stating that he wanted a DNA test. It was not because he questioned her honesty, but because he needed a legal basis before entering Amelia's life. "I don't want to show up with just words," he explained. "I want to show up with responsibility, and that requires paperwork." Camille was silent on the phone for a moment. She had nothing to conceal, and she knew that in the American legal system, a DNA test was the first formal step in establishing paternity, a reality she both dreaded and could not deny her child. "Okay," she finally said, "but we do it my way. I choose the lab, not you." Ronan agreed instantly. The test was conducted at a private clinic in Lakeview that Camille had found online. It was a neutral place, with no ties to the Marchetti family name. A gentle swab was taken from Amelia's cheek, which the little girl accepted as a routine health check without any questions. It took 2 weeks for the results to come back. For different reasons, those were the longest 2 weeks of their lives. Camille existed in a state of suspended reality. Her mornings were spent taking Amelia to school, her afternoons were for managing contracts, and her evenings were for cooking dinner and reading bedtime stories. On the surface, nothing had changed, but just beneath that calm routine lay the constant knowledge that their world was about to shift, and she had no power over its new direction. Ronan spent those 2 weeks learning everything he could about Amelia. He did it discreetly, using only publicly available information. The Orasco Academy website had photos of student events. He found Amelia in a picture from a class math competition, standing in the front row with a paper medal hanging on her chest. In another photo, she was in the schoolyard next to a smaller boy, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. The caption read, "Amelia Reyes was praised by her teacher for helping a new student feel welcome." Ronan stared at that image for a very long time. His daughter was protecting someone vulnerable, the exact opposite of what he had done 6 years prior. But the detail that truly shook him was from a small post on the Pilsen Community Center's website about a career day for kids. Each child was asked what they wanted to be. Next to the name Amelia Reyes, age 5, her answer was written precisely. "I want to build a house nobody can break." Ronan read the sentence over and over. Marchetti Holdings, the empire his family had built and he now controlled, was founded on construction and real estate, on erecting massive structures of steel and concrete. And here was a child who did not know her father, who had never entered a building bearing the Marchetti name, and yet she wanted to build houses. It was clear that blood did not need a birth certificate to prove its connection. It always finds its own path. The results were delivered on a Thursday morning in a secure email to both of them. Ronan opened the file in his office. It was a single page of cold scientific data and statistics. At the bottom, the conclusion stated, "Probability of paternity, 99.9%. He had already known it was true. Her gray-green eyes had confirmed it the first time he saw her. But knowing something and seeing it in black and white are two different things. The official document transformed his suspicion into a certainty he now had to answer for. The paper trembled in his hand, not from shock, but from the immense weight of 6 lost years, now officially his responsibility. Once the results were confirmed, Ronan called Camille to ask if he could meet Amelia. Camille immediately laid out her terms. The meeting had to be in a public space, with no bodyguards, and no one else could know. She would introduce him only as a friend of her mother's. Ronan accepted all her conditions without argument because he knew this was not a negotiation where he held any power to make demands. They decided to meet at Millennium Park on a Saturday afternoon. Ronan showed up 30 minutes early. He parked his car 2 blocks away and walked to the park. He wore a simple black shirt and dark pants instead of a suit. He had taken off his expensive watch and left it in the car. For the first time in many years, he was completely alone, with no security detail watching his back. He found a stone bench near the Cloud Gate sculpture and watched children laughing and running around the giant steel structure. He realized it was the first time he had sat alone in a public place without scanning the crowd for threats or watching for someone who might need his attention. His only thought was of a 5-year-old girl who would soon be there, and he had no idea what to say to her. He had faced down federal judges without flinching, and stared down rival bosses without blinking. But the idea of speaking to his own 5-year-old daughter was making his palms sweat. And then he saw them. Camille was walking from Michigan Avenue, holding the hand of a little girl in a red coat, whose black hair was pulled back into a ponytail that bounced with her energetic steps. Amelia gazed around the park with wide, gray-green eyes, her expression full of curiosity. Ronan's heart pounded in his ears as he stood up when they approached. Camille stopped before him and said in a calm voice, "Amelia, this is Ronan, a friend of Mommy's." Amelia tilted her head all the way back to look up at him, because he was so much taller than her. Their eyes met, gray-green looking into gray, and Ronan felt a profound connection deep inside him, in a place he thought had been sealed off long ago. "Hello, sir," Amelia said, her voice clear and confident. She was not timid or shy, just polite, like a well-raised child greeting an adult. "Hello, Amelia," Ronan replied, trying to keep his voice from breaking as his throat grew tight. The three of them sat on the bench. Camille sat between them at first, but Amelia soon scooted over to sit next to Ronan, eager to ask him about the giant, shiny bean sculpture. Ronan explained that it was called Cloudgate. She nodded, then started talking about her school, her best friend, Lucia, and the painting of a tall building with many windows that she had made in art class. Ronan listened to her, and he truly listened. It was not the kind of listening where you just wait for your turn to speak. He listened because every single word from this little girl felt incredibly precious. "What is your job?" Amelia asked him suddenly. "I build houses," Ronan replied, simplifying the massive Marchetti Holdings empire into 3 words a 5-year-old could grasp. "Big houses or small ones?" she asked. "Both," he said. Amelia tilted her head, thinking for a moment. "I like small houses more. Small houses feel warmer." Camille had to look away so they would not see the tears welling up in her eyes. Amelia's innocent words were not meant to hurt, but they pierced through all the layers of Ronan's wealth, because his enormous Gold Coast mansion had never once felt warm. A little later, Camille bought Amelia an ice cream cone from a vendor. The girl chose chocolate, and after 2 licks, she had a brown smudge on the tip of her nose. Amelia crossed her eyes trying to see it, and then she let out a bright, happy laugh that filled the afternoon air. As Ronan watched her laugh, he began to laugh too. The polite smile he used for social events. It was not the icy smile he wore during business deals, but a genuine smile that lit up his eyes before it ever touched his lips. It was the kind of smile he could not recall wearing for years. When Camille saw that smile, something shifted inside her, a small, quiet change, like a locked door creaking open another fraction of an inch, and she felt torn between wanting to push it open and slam it shut. Not even a week after their meeting in Millennium Park, a ghost from the past resurfaced. Gianni Marchetti had not vanished, as Ronan had expected. After being exiled from the family, cut off from every bank account, every resource, and every bit of protection the Marchetti name offered, Gianni ended up on the south side. With his old debts looming and his bitterness growing each day, he contacted the Vulov Syndicate. This was the same Eastern European mafia he once owed gambling debts to. He offered them a straightforward exchange: inside information on the Marchetti organization for their protection and some cash. Gianni knew the security protocols of the Gold Coast mansion, Ronan's daily routine, the names of all the guards, and the vulnerabilities in the family's financial operations, and he was ready to sell every secret. But the most dangerous information Gianni possessed was not written in any ledger or security plan. In the weeks following his banishment, before Ronan had sealed every leak, Gianni still had a former contact on the security staff who would send him occasional text messages. From these brief updates, Gianni learned that Ronan had started going somewhere alone every Saturday, which was highly unusual. Driven by curiosity, Gianni tailed him and saw Ronan in Millennium Park with a woman and a young girl. The girl had the same gray-green eyes as Ronan. Gianni did not need any test to know what he was seeing. The phone call reached Ronan at 11 o'clock on a weeknight. Ronan knew it was his brother's voice right away. "I thought you told me I was not a Marchetti anymore," Gianni said, his voice dripping with a mix of resentment and victory. "But it looks like you have a little secret you would rather nobody knew about. A young daughter over in Pilsen. She has your eyes. It would be a real tragedy if someone found out about her, would it not, brother?" Ronan was silent for 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds stretched into an eternity. In that short time, he understood that Amelia was not just his daughter. She had just been turned into a target. This was the exact scenario Camille had dreaded 6 years ago. It was precisely why she had kept their child from him. And now, her worst fear was a reality. He hung up the phone. He immediately contacted his head of security and assigned 2 men to watch the apartment in Pilsen around the clock. After that, he drove to Pilsen himself, arriving close to midnight. He parked across from the red brick apartment building where Camille lived and walked up the stairs to the third floor for the very first time. He saw cracked concrete steps, a wobbly iron handrail, a flickering light in the hallway, and peeling paint that revealed the old brick underneath. Ronan took it all in and felt a sharp stab of shame right through his chest. His daughter had spent 5 years of her life here, while he slept in a mansion with bulletproof windows and heated floors. Camille answered after he knocked 3 times. Her eyes were alert and cautious. She wore an old nightgown, and her hair was down. The moment she saw Ronan, she knew something was terribly wrong. He was not the type of man to appear on her doorstep at midnight without a very good reason. Ronan told her everything about Gianni's call. About when the threat of Amelia being discovered arose, Camille did not feel fear. She felt rage. The anger she had suppressed for 6 years finally broke free in a quiet, cutting tone. This is the very reason I never wanted you to know my secrets. This is the life I fought to keep my daughter away from, and you brought it to my home. Ronan stood motionless and absorbed her words because he knew they were true. He had no defense against her accusations. I know, he finally said, but your anger at me does not matter right now. Amelia needs to be safe. Let me provide that safety. Not for my sake, but for hers. Camille stared at him in the shabby hallway of a place he would never have entered on his own. She realized that even if she slammed the door on him, the threat beyond it would not just disappear. Amelia must not know, she said, her voice still firm, moving from fury to a firm resolve. Her daily life cannot change at all. No guards taking her to school, no special cars, nothing to make her afraid. If you are going to protect your daughter, do it so she never knows she is being protected. Ronan agreed with a nod and drove back to the Gold Coast to handle Gianni in the language his world understood. Yelena followed the money trail from the Volkov syndicate straight to Gianni. She then severed it completely by proving to Vulov that Gianni had inflated the value of his information to get more money. In an instant, Gianni went from a trusted source to a common swindler in the eyes of his protectors. At the same time, Ronan delivered a sharp, clear message to the Vulov syndicate. Any action against the Marchetti family would be seen as a declaration of war, and a war with them was something no Chicago outfit could win. Vulov got the message. Gianni's protection, his money, and all his leverage vanished. 2 weeks later, he boarded a westbound bus in the middle of the night, vanishing from the city just like Camille had vanished from the Gold Coast mansion 6 years before. But Camille had left with her head held high, while Gianni left with nothing but a worthless reputation. Once the Gianni threat was gone, the Saturday meetups in Millennium Park resumed. Every week, Ronan would get there early. He wore no suit and kept no guards close by. However, he now had 2 men watching from a distance on his orders, men Amelia would never see. His visits soon became a familiar, comforting part of her Saturdays. She would show him her grades in math, tell him about a new drawing she made, and ask him about everything from how skyscrapers stay up to why the sky in Chicago was so often gray. Ronan found a deep well of patience inside himself to answer every single question, a patience his world had never taught him. As months went by, Camille watched from a distance, never stepping in, but always paying attention. She noticed how Amelia started to anticipate Ronan's arrival more and more. She saw how her daughter would sprint toward him the instant she saw him at their usual bench. She listened as Amelia began to tell stories at home that started with, Uncle Ronan said. Camille then knew the time for secrets was coming to an end. Amelia had a right to know the truth. Every day she waited was another day her daughter was living a life that was not quite real. Camille picked a peaceful Sunday afternoon. She asked Ronan to come to their apartment in Pilsen. He climbed those same brick steps for the second time, but this visit was not about a danger, but about a truth. Amelia was on the old couch, sketching in her book, when Ronan came inside. She looked up and smiled. Uncle Ronan? She said, before returning to her drawing. Camille sat next to her, and Ronan sat in the chair facing them. The small living room brought the three of them close, almost near enough to touch. A ceiling fan spun slowly overhead. The late-day sun streamed through the window, casting a warm light on the worn wooden floor. Camille gently rested her hand on Amelia's knee, a signal for her to pause her drawing and look up. "Amelia, I need to tell you something very important." Amelia put her pencil down, her gaze shifting from her mom to Ronan and back again. Her gray-green eyes held a seriousness that was rare for her age. "Ronan is more than just my friend," Camille explained, her voice steady even as she held onto Amelia's knee to stop her own hand from shaking. "He is your father." A deep quiet filled the room. It was not a dramatic pause from a movie, but the quiet of a 5-year-old's mind, grappling with a truth too vast for her world. Yet she seemed to understand more than most grown-ups would expect. Amelia did not cry, she did not yell, she stared at Ronan for a very long time, her eyes a perfect copy of his, before her small voice asked with perfect clarity, "Why weren't you here from the very beginning, Dad?" The question was simple, yet it held the weight of 5 Father's Days with no card to present. It held 5 years of hearing friends talk about their dads, all while she never knew she had one. It was 5 years of seeing a blank space on her birth certificate and never asking her mother why. Ronan didn't offer any excuses or long explanations, nor did he blame the situation. "Because I was wrong," he said in a low voice, his gaze fixed on his daughter. "And it took me a very long time to understand." Amelia tilted her head, thinking deeply as she always did, and then she posed one more question. "Do you understand now?" "I do," Ronan answered. "One word." He knew the 5-year-old before him didn't need complicated reasons. She just needed to know that her father was here now and that he finally understood. Amelia set her notebook down, got off the sofa, and took 2 little steps toward Ronan to give him a hug. The embrace was quick and light, with 2 tiny arms wrapping around the neck of a man she had called her uncle just months earlier. But that hug was powerful enough to bridge 6 years of distance in a way words never could. Ronan hugged his daughter back, his touch careful and gentle, as if he were holding the most precious thing he had ever held. Because he was. He was not a man who hugged people. His life left no space for tenderness. But when his daughter's arms gently tightened around his neck, an instinct deeper than any of his defenses told him to place a hand on her back and hold her close. Camille watched them from the sofa. As Amelia rested her cheek on Ronan's shoulder, Camille turned her face to the window. Tears rolled down her cheeks, not of sadness or fear, but of sheer relief. For 6 years she had carried this secret by herself. Now, that burden was no longer hers alone. Her daughter finally knew she had a father, and the child did not cry. She hugged. Sometimes, the forgiveness of a 5-year-old is simpler and stronger than any court in the world. In the weeks following that Sunday, the word "dad" began to emerge from Amelia's mouth like a small animal, learning to take its first steps. The first time she spoke, it was at the park, so quietly it was nearly a whisper. "Dad, look at what I drew." Then she looked up at Ronan, as if to confirm that using the word was okay. Ronan nodded, his eyes getting a little misty, but he turned away quickly. The next week she said it a bit louder. "Dad, Lucia also likes to draw houses, like me." The week after, the word came as easily as breathing. "Dad, I'm hungry." And Ronan realized it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in his 37 years of life. Their bond was built one brick at a time. Ronan started to become a part of Amelia's daily life, not with his money or power, but with his presence. When Erasco Academy sent home an invitation for the parent meeting at the start of the year, Camille asked Ronan if he wanted to join her. He showed up and sat on a small blue plastic chair in the kindergarten classroom. His knees were nearly to his chest because the chairs were meant for parents to sit beside their kids, and he was surrounded by regular fathers in t-shirts and jeans. Ronan Marchetti looked so out of place that it was almost comical. He was taller than most men in the room, his back perfectly straight from years of sitting at the head of conference tables. Even though he tried to dress down, his Italian leather jacket was still worth more than the clothes of the three fathers next to him combined. But when the teacher asked Amelia who she wanted to introduce from her family, she stood up, pointed at Ronan and said, "This is my dad." Her voice was completely normal and full of pride. And in that moment, Ronan didn't feel out of place at all. He was simply a dad sitting on a tiny plastic chair, and that was the only title that mattered in that room. A few weeks after that, Amelia brought a drawing home from her art class. She put it on the kitchen table in their Pilsen apartment for Camille to see. The drawing was of a house with big windows and a red roof, and in front stood three people side by side. The tallest was on the left, the medium one was in the middle, and the smallest was on the right. Above them, in the shaky handwriting of a 5-year-old, Amelia had written, "Mom, Dad, and me." Camille stared at it for a very long time. She did not cry, having already shed enough tears, but she felt a warmth spreading through her chest. It was a feeling that 6 years of holding herself together alone had made her forget could even exist. She attached the drawing to the refrigerator with a flower-shaped magnet, and it stayed there from that day on. Then it was time for Amelia's first weekend at the Gold Coast mansion. Camille finally agreed after many talks with Ronan, setting firm rules about schedules and contact. Ronan had a room made for Amelia, not a luxurious hotel suite, but a real room with books on the shelves, a box of colored pencils on the desk, a soft blanket on the bed, and natural light coming from a window that looked out on the garden. Amelia walked into the mansion, her eyes wide as she took everything in. She touched the wooden stair railing, looked up at the high ceilings, and ran through a living room that was bigger than their whole Pilsen apartment. She then stopped in the middle of a long hallway and said, "This house is really big, but it's kind of sad, Dad." Ronan, walking just behind her, stopped. "Why is it sad?" "Because there isn't any laughter." The sentence was simple, as a child's sentences often are, but it was more perceptive than any analysis Yolena had ever given him. Because this mansion truly did not have any laughter. It never had. From his father's time to his own, this house had only ever been filled with orders, silence, and the sound of footsteps on wooden floors. That night, father and daughter watched a cartoon in the huge living room. Amelia curled up on the sofa beside Ronan, her feet in cat-patterned socks that Camille had bought at a thrift store. In the middle of the movie, Amelia raised her head and asked Ronan in a sleepy but serious voice, "Dad, do you regret it?" Ronan looked down at his daughter. "Yes, regret what?" "Not listening to your mom when she needed you to listen." Amelia thought for a moment, her gray-green eyes blinking slowly from sleepiness. Then she said, "Then it is okay, because now you listen." And she turned back to the movie as if she had just solved a simple math problem. But for Ronan, it was not simple at all. It was forgiveness. It was not the conditional kind that adults offer, but the total, unguarded forgiveness of a child who believes in the present more than the past. And he sat there in the living room of his own house and heard laughter in this mansion for the first time when Amelia giggled at a cartoon character falling. He realized the 5-year-old curled beside him had given him something that no one in the mafia world ever had, a real reason to change. Rumors spread like wildfire in Chicago's upper class because the world of the wealthy is smaller than people think, and their mouths are much wider. Ronan Marchetti has an illegitimate daughter with a former housekeeper. The story moved from one dinner party to the next cocktail hour like a piece of high-class entertainment. At a charity fundraiser at the Peninsula Hotel on a Friday night, where Chicago businessmen and politicians stood together with wine glasses and fake smiles, a business partner named Harrison Burke, the owner of a real estate company that competed with Marchetti Holdings, leaned in and said to a group of men near Ronan, in a voice just loud enough for him to hear, I heard Marchetti's playing house now with the maid and the little bastard kid in Pilsen. I guess that is his new charity project. A small ripple of laughter went through the group. Ronan set his glass down on the bar, turned, and took 2 steps until he stood right in front of Harrison Burke. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to, because everyone around them knew that when Ronan Marchetti spoke softly, that was when he was at his most dangerous. The woman you just mentioned built a company with her own 2 hands while you sat counting the inheritance your father left you. She is the mother of my daughter. The next time you speak about her, make sure you have earned the right. Harrison Burke turned pale. For several long seconds, no one in the room said a word because they all knew that Ronan's words were not a gentleman's defense of honor. They were a final warning, the Marchetti kind of warning, and that kind of warning did not come twice. That night after the party, Ronan drove back to the mansion alone and thought about what he had just done. He had publicly acknowledged Amelia to Chicago's elite and had placed Camille's dignity alongside his family's. He did not regret it. But at the same time, in the Pilsen apartment, Camille was facing a different kind of fear. Amelia had just returned from her weekend at the Gold Coast mansion. And all through dinner, she talked nonstop about her room at her dad's house, about the wide garden, and about a bathtub as big as the entire bedroom she shared with her mother. Camille listened and smiled, but inside, grew stiff. Ronan's world offered so much more in every way. Camille worried that her little 2-bedroom apartment, decorated with paper butterflies from magazines and a small bed against the wall, would start to seem plain and unimpressive to her little girl. But later, as Camille was tucking Amelia into bed, the little girl cuddled into her familiar sheets, held her worn teddy bear close, and whispered sleepily, "Mommy, our bed is warmer. Dad's bed is huge, but this one is warmer." Camille sat on the bed for a long moment, then leaned over to kiss her daughter's forehead. She realized that love could never be measured by the size of a room, and that her daughter, at just 5 years old, already understood the difference between big and cozy, between having more and having enough. 15 meters away, Ronan walked into his office at the mansion, where his grandfather's portrait always hung. Grandfather Marchetti, the man who forged this empire from violence and secrets, stared down with painted eyes that held no expression. Ronan glanced at the portrait, then down to his phone. The screen was still lit with a picture of Amelia smiling, a dab of ice cream on her nose. He had made it his wallpaper after that day in Millennium Park. He saw 2 different worlds in those 2 faces. His grandfather had created an empire with fear. His daughter just wanted a home that was safe. For the very first time, Ronan considered making a change, not due to pressure from the government or for a business reason, but because he could not stand the thought of Amelia one day learning the dark truth about what her father was. Leaving the empire was not an option. In his world, there was no such thing as retirement. But he could start moving things toward legitimate business, slowly phasing out the illegal operations and creating stronger barriers between the darkness and his family. He did this so that when Amelia was old enough to ask what he did for a living, his answer, "I build houses," would be closer to the truth than a lie. The connection between Ronan and Camille did not change in a single big event. It happened in 100 tiny moments, one built upon the last, over many weeks. He began to call her before any decision that affected Amelia. From buying his daughter new shoes to deciding which weekends she would stay at the mansion, she began answering his calls without her stomach twisting into the knots it did at first. They discovered how to talk to one another, not like a boss and his maid, or a mobster and the woman he'd destroyed, but as 2 grown-ups sharing a duty to a child. Camille never forgot what happened, and Ronan never denied his part in it. But they both put Amelia before their own pride, which was the only solid ground to build on. One night after a parent-teacher conference, Ronan offered Camille a ride home to Pilsen since it was raining and she had taken the bus. Camille paused for a moment before saying yes, Not because she couldn't get home, but because she was done rejecting help just to make a point. They drove mostly in silence, exchanging a few words about Amelia, her grades in math, and a new drawing of hers up on the classroom wall. By the time the car pulled up to her brick apartment building, the downpour had become a drizzle, leaving the air cool and damp with the scent of wet pavement. Camille opened her door but stopped when Ronan spoke. "Thank you for not shutting me out completely." She glanced back at him. The yellow glow of the streetlight coming through the windshield softened Ronan's features. Unlike the cold, hard face she recalled from 6 years ago, there was a subtle change there, just enough for her to see it. "I'm not doing it for you," she said with total honesty. "This is for Amelia." "I know," he replied. Just 2 words, but the quiet, deliberate way he said them while holding her gaze said more than any sentence could. Camille looked back, her expression something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness. Not quite. But the rigid wall she kept between them was gone too. It was a feeling that existed in the space between the past and the future, between the injury and the chance for it to heal. And for that brief moment, they both felt it. Nobody moved closer. There was no kiss, no touch, and no promises were made. It was just a single, honest moment between two people who had deeply wounded each other, now standing on the delicate line between all that was lost and what could possibly be salvaged. Camille got out of the car, said goodnight, and walked into her building, never looking back. Ronan waited in the car, watching until the door closed, and didn't pull away immediately. He was aware that what was growing between them wasn't some fiery, cinematic love. It was something slower, more substantial, and far more real, founded on acknowledged mistakes and a respect they were earning day by day. And perhaps that was the only way for two people like them to connect. One was raised to be suspicious of everyone, and the other had learned she didn't need anyone at all. This was how they could move toward one another without shattering the fragile trust they were both trying to guard. On a spring afternoon, when Chicago finally shed its gray winter coat, and the sky over Lake Michigan was a brilliant, endless blue, the three of them went back to Millennium Park. The same stone bench was there, the same shiny cloud gate sculpture reflected the clouds, the same sound of children's laughter floated over the lawn, but everything felt new. 6 years before, Camille had left a Gold Coast mansion in the rain with nothing but the secret life she carried inside her. Today, she walked next to the man who had cast her out, not because the past was erased, but because she had made the choice to move on. Amelia ran on ahead, her dark hair flying in the breeze as her sneakers tapped on the stone walkway. Her bright laugh echoed in the open space between the towers. Ronan and Camille followed slowly behind, not holding hands or linking arms, but walking side by side. They were close enough for their shoulders to nearly touch, yet far enough apart for both of them to feel at ease. Camille watched her daughter play and said, her tone as calm as if discussing the weather, but her words held the weight of 6 long years. "You realize, don't you? That day in your office was the worst day I've ever lived, but it was also the start of everything I have now." Ronan walked a few more paces in silence before he responded. "And it was the day I lost the most important thing in my life, and I was too foolish to even know it." They said nothing more. Nothing more was needed. The past was still there, not forgotten or wiped clean, but it was no longer a barrier separating them. It was their foundation. A broken and ugly one, for sure, but still strong enough to build something better upon. Amelia stopped by the reflecting pool, turned to see them lagging behind, and then ran back. Her loose hair and gray-green eyes were shining in the afternoon light as she grabbed her mother's hand with her left and her father's with her right. "Come on, slowpokes, last one there buys ice cream," she said, pulling them forward. And so, the three of them walked together beside the water. They weren't a perfect family, and this was no fairy tale with a kiss in a grand castle. They were just three people who had been broken, who had made errors, who had lost so much, and who had decided to grow together, rather than let the past trap them. We sometimes think that the worst thing in the world is to lose control. But the truly dangerous thing is not losing control. It is refusing to listen. Not listening when someone is desperately trying to explain their side. Not listening when the truth is right there in front of you. Not listening when your pride is screaming louder than your heart. Camille lost a job, but she discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. Ronan lost 6 years, but he learned how to be a dad, something that power and money could never buy. And Amelia grew up learning that love is not something you purchase with a big house or a fancy car. It is proven by being present, by being patient, and by spending Saturday afternoons on a park bench and having your questions answered with honesty. Our mistakes do not have to define our lives, but only if we find the courage to admit them and change. Responsibility is not a commodity you can buy with cash. It is something you earn through your actions day after day. And we get second chances, not because we are entitled to them, but because someone else is kind enough to open a door they had every right to keep locked forever. For those of you hearing this story, please remember this lesson. Never make a choice without hearing the other side. Do not let arrogance make your decisions for you. Do not judge a person by their situation, because you have no idea what battles they fought just to be standing where they are. Life will always give you back the seeds you plant. And love, no matter how long it has been buried under wreckage, will always find a way to rebuild if you just give it the space to grow. If this story moved you, I want to know how it made you feel. Which person in the story did you relate to the most? Have you ever had to make a choice when no one would listen? Or were you the one who refused to listen, only to regret it later? Please share your thoughts in the comments, because every story shared is precious, and I want to listen with my whole heart. If you found some meaning in this tale, please press the like button and share this video with the people you care about. Someone you know might need to hear this very story at this very moment. And if you are not yet a subscriber, please subscribe now and turn on your notifications so you do not miss our new stories each day. Because on this channel, every story has a lesson that might just change how you look at the world. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a life filled with joy and peace in your hearts every day. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. Goodbye, and I look forward to seeing you in our next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.